Hello, I'm Kenneth Lopatin, curator of antiquities at the Getty Villa Museum in Los Angeles, home to the Getty Museum's collection of ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all today to our program, Patrons and Priestesses, The Lives of Ancient Women in Pompeii, presented by Professor Brenda Longfellow. Today's program is in celebration of International Women's Day last Sunday and Women's History Month, honoring significant contributions women have made throughout history. And among the many remarkable discoveries in Pompeii are the names of nearly 800 women who lived and worked there, shaping this vibrant community. And we're thrilled to have as today's speaker, Brenda Longfellow, the Roger A. Hornsby Professor of Classics at the University of Iowa. Professor Longfellow is the author of the recently published book, The Lives and Death of Women in Ancient Pompeii, as well as earlier studies such as Roman imperialism, form, meaning, and ideology in monumental fountain complexes. And she's also the co-editor of Women's Lives, Women's Voices, Roman Material Culture and Female Agency in the Bay of Naples, and of Roman artists, patrons, and public consumption, Familiar Works Reconsidered. So we've absolutely got the best person here today to give this talk. But without further ado, I want to hand the floor, the screen, over to Professor Longfellow. Brenda, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lopatin, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Getty Villa Public Programs for the invitation to speak today. I especially appreciate all the help and guidance that was offered to me by Shelby Brown, R.M. Atiam, and Lisa Koss. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I am delighted to be giving this lecture in honor of International Women's Day and Women's History Month. And today's talk stems from the book I wrote called The Lives and Deaths of Women in Ancient Pompeii. I was inspired to write this book because there's long been a mismatch between what the archaeological evidence reveals about women in Pompeii and what scholarship has focused on. Material record shows that women were far more active in economic and community life than we had traditionally assumed, and today I want to show you how. Today I'll primarily be focusing on two Pompeian women who made significant contributions as patrons and priestesses, Eumachia, whose portrait you see on the screen, and her contemporary named Mamia. To do that, I'll begin with a brief overview of Pompeii and why it is such a rich source of evidence for women's lives. Then I'll introduce the basic ways in which Roman women were involved with economic and social decisions by focusing on what Pompeii tells us about female property ownership. I'll draw on examples of female homeowners and tomb builders in order to give some social and economic context for the women who built civic monuments and held religious offices. These women include Eumachia, who paid for the largest public building in Pompeii. My goal with this talk is to show that when we treat the physical evidence as our primary evidence for Roman women's lives, we get a very different and much fuller picture than we get from ancient texts alone. So why has this picture been so incomplete? Well, our knowledge of almost any woman in the Roman world, including those in Pompeii, is often colored by the viewpoint of ancient authors who are primarily elite men. These authors generally focus on how senatorial and imperial women lived up to societal expectations about the female experience. When talking about women, these authors emphasize how these elite women adhere to the Roman female virtues like modesty and faithfulness, beauty and fertility, piety and family devotion. And often these texts inform how we approach the images of women preserved at Pompeii, like this one of Eumachia you see here. In this uncontextualized image, she is read as a fashionable, beautiful, and respectable matron, full stop. But as we will see today, this portrait was much more than a simple portrait. Rather, this portrait was installed in the massive complex that she built for the city, and it was set up to honor Eumachia as a patron. And I want to note that Eumachia was not alone in receiving this public honor. In fact, 24% of the extant examples of the honorific portrait statues in Pompeii actually honor women. 24%. We also have evidence for the Pompeian women who took it upon themselves to build tombs for their families and made economic decisions that shaped their community. These are not the women described in our historical sources. Rather, they are the women revealed by the material remains in Pompeii, and they are who we are talking about today. So let me begin with a brief introduction to the city that probably needs no introduction, and that's Pompeii. Pompeii is a large town of regional importance located about 150 miles southeast of Rome and along the Bay of Naples. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, this rather ordinary town was made remarkable by its extraordinary state of preservation. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it spewed so much ash and lapilli into the air that the buildings of Pompeii were buried up to their second stories within 24 hours. The map you see on the screen shows which cities were directly impacted by the fallout from the eruption, and you can see that Pompeii was in the thick of it. This catastrophe transformed this regional town with about 27,000 people into one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, the fame of which was helped by the eyewitness account of Pliny the Younger, who was in Misenum at the time of the eruption. You can see Misenum to the left of the map. He was there because his uncle, Pliny the Elder, was stationed there with the Roman fleet. Pliny the Elder had just published an encyclopedia on natural history 2 years prior, and so he was eager to see the eruption up close. Pliny the Elder invited his nephew to join him on the adventure, but Pliny the Younger said that he really preferred to work on the writings his uncle had assigned to him than going off to see the eruption, and so he stayed home while his uncle sailed off towards the eruption in which he perished. The eruption preserves evocative evidence for daily life that remains unparalleled by finds from other Roman communities. Particularly striking are the organic remains that are preserved. These include the casts of the people who didn't flee, carbonized loaves of bread left in the oven of a bakery, wooden doors shut against the onslaught, and wax tablets cached by a banker that preserved the names and financial interactions of hundreds of Pompeians, including 14 women, one of whom is named as a witness on a tablet. The city of Pompeii is famous not only because of these types of evidence that have been preserved, but also because of how much of it remains. The city covers about 160 acres, which is basically the size of Disneyland. About 2/3 of Pompeii have been excavated over the past 278 years, and this map shows those excavated areas in that taupe beige color. The map shows us the lining of the city walls, as well as the streets, city blocks, and buildings within these walls. These nice, straight roads running through Pompeii are equipped with tall sidewalks and stepping stones to help people avoid the sewage in the streets that was slowly oozing towards the Sarno River. These streets are lined with the facades of houses and businesses that give glimpses of how people live their lives. Within these houses, we have extraordinary paintings that covered the entire walls of the rooms as well as the ceilings, and they were matched with mosaic floors below. This is one of the most famous paintings from Pompeii, and it displays almost life-size women and the other followers of the wine god Dionysus. Excavated in 1909, the room depicts a woman's initiation into the secret rites of Dionysus. Dionysus was among the gods most often included in the household shrines of Pompeii, and he had a sanctuary outside of the city for use by the men and women initiates of his cult. In addition to these extraordinary paintings, Pompeii also provides well-preserved examples of domestic architecture, like this dining room, which is located in the very first house excavated at Pompeii during the years 1755 to 1757. This room features stone couches based in marble and on these couches guests would recline while enjoying entertainment and a multi-course meal. To make this space even more pleasant, the walls were painted in nilotic scenes that have since faded, and statues stood in the two niches along the back wall. That central staircase to nowhere in that back wall is of particular interest. On the top of the roof above this room is a small cistern, and water would be released from the cistern to cascade down that staircase set into the back wall, effectively creating an artificial waterfall that enhanced the dining experience. The view from this room was onto this lush garden space, which featured a watercourse running down the center and a shaded walkway along the edge. I want to draw your attention to the name of the photographer here, Norman Nerberg, because he was a vital contributor to the Getty Villa. As you know, the architecture of the Getty Villa is based on the ancient Villa of the Papyri located at Herculaneum. Norman Nerberg was an ancient art historian who became the historical consultant for the construction of the Getty Villa, in addition to providing us with this wonderful photo. Okay, so returning to the women in ancient Pompeii. I want to note that ancient Roman historical sources often depict the Roman women's domain as limited to family and household. In contrast, the male public sphere symbolized by the forum. And the forum served as the administrative, religious, and commercial heart of a Roman city, including Pompeii. The evidence from Pompeii, however, indicates that both genders were engaged in various aspects of life within and beyond the confines of the home. For instance, at least one, and probably two, and maybe even three of the buildings lining the Forum in Pompeii were paid for by women. These include the multi-purpose edifice built by Eumachia that displayed her portrait statue. In order to contextualize how Eumachia became a major public patron of the city, I want to introduce the economic and social agency of Pompeian women more broadly. My first example is a house and its associated businesses that we know were owned by a woman, and this is located here. I've marked it in yellow on the map. My second example comes from a handful of tombs built by Pompeian women, and these tombs are located in the cemeteries that I've outlined in yellow. I will use these domestic and funerary spaces to discuss the evidence in Pompeii that women not only owned property, but also ran businesses and took responsibility for the family tombs. Once I've established these basic aspects of Roman social norms, I will turn to the evidence of elite women who brought new amenities into the heart of the city. And here I've marked the forum for you. And these women include Eumachia. These amenities allow us to see how women shaped Pompeian social and religious life through their positions as public priestesses, by adding new civic and religious complexes to the city, and even by introducing new deities into the city's pantheon. What is particularly interesting is the material evidence at Pompeii allows us not only to see what these women are doing, but also how the city and community groups acknowledge the efforts of these women by awarding them honors. These public honors typically took the form of the gifting of public land to use for their tombs and setting up honorific portrait statues in visible places throughout the city. The evidence at Pompeii tells us that women were honored with tomb plots and honorific statues fairly frequently, as our material remains tell us that women make up approximately 1 out of every 4 Pompeians honored in these two ways. But before we talk about honors, let's begin by looking at women as homeowners. Today, I'll focus on the large estate known as the estate of Julia Felix, where we can see a female property owner and her associated businesses. I'll talk about how we know Julia Felix is the owner in a minute, but first I want to walk through the types of spaces encompassed by the estate. We've already been introduced to this summer dining room and interior garden, and they are located here on the plan of the estate. These architectural spaces are part of a large first-story house that occupies about a quarter of the property, and here I'll show you the entire expanse of the house in yellow. Today's conception of a house as a place for the family and invited guests, as a place that offers refuge from the outside world, this idea is actually antithetical to the Roman idea of a house. In the Roman world, the house was an extension of the homeowner's social role and thus designed to be a place for business dealings, religious activities, and entertainment. Cicero tells us that an elite man in Rome needs a house that suits his social standing. He says that it must offer hospitality and be large enough for a crowd, but not so large that those gathering within it fail to fill it, because the empty spaces would speak to the homeowner's misunderstanding of their place in society. Seneca the Younger tells us that patrons would be visited in their atria each morning by crowds of clients paying their respects, as well as those looking for favors. The congested atrium during this ritual of salutatio would have been visible to passers-by through the open door, and, like the size of the house, was intended to mirror the relative social importance and power of the homeowner. Taken together, our historical sources tell us that the success of the homeowner was made visible by the house as well as by the large crowd that came to it. This house in Pompeii has all the amenities our historical sources tell us a wealthy homeowner would have, including 2 atria and the peristyle garden. And here I mark for you where the atria are. The Roman architect Vitruvius tells us that atria and peristyles are public spaces within the house, meaning that you could enter those without an invitation. Invited guests would have been welcome to rooms beyond the atria and peristyle for more intimate conversations and entertainment. These more intimate spaces included smaller rooms around the back atrium, and then those places for entertainment would be larger ones, like the triclinium facing the peristyle. Outside the confines of this house, the rest of the real estate of this property is taken up with businesses and commercial endeavors. Among these is a large bath complex, which I've colored in blue. This bath is well appointed, with light and airy rooms designated for cold, warm, and hot bathing, as the Romans do. The bath is lavishly decorated and has a number of really nice amenities. These include heated floors and marble benches. And there's a large swimming pool, and I'll outline that for you in the black here. And this swimming pool was paired with a nearby fountain to enhance the bather's delight. A large enclosed green space east of the pool, to the left of the pool, served as a place for exercise. In addition to the large bath complex, there are 4 shops, which I've marked in green. 2 of these shops on the north side of the estate have L-shaped counters at which ready-to-eat food would be sold. The larger of these bars is located at doorway 7 and is unusually well appointed. It has an attached kitchen with an oven, as well as masonry tables and benches for diners to eat at, either seated or reclining. Within the first-story house, there are at least 2 sets of stairs that are marked in red, and these probably led to second-floor apartments. The rest of the walled estate was cultivated and featured an orchard with planting beds. Agriculture played a huge role in the economic life of Pompeii, as the fertile lands in and around the city made its property owners wealthy by growing grapes or figs and other fruit trees. And Cato tells us that Pompeii was absolutely famous for its cabbages. And so oftentimes the planting beds of this particular orchard are imagined as being reserved for those cabbages. But we don't actually know what was grown in there, whether it was vegetables or flowers or a combination. The positioning of this large house within and among a variety of commercial and cultivated spaces is pretty typical for Pompeii. What is not typical is the size of the estate, which is much larger than most at 5,900 square meters. Also not typical is our ability to put a homeowner's name with the house. And in this case, the homeowner is a woman, Julia Felix. We have her name because she offered a portion of the estate for rent. Here is the rental notice. And it reads, to rent for a period of 5 years, from the 13th day of next August to the 13th day of the 6th August, the Venus Bath, an elevated bath suite for prestige clients, which I've marked in blue in the plan, shops with living quarters above, and 2 of those shops marked in green, the 2 bars, have staircases leading to a mezzanine level. So those are probably the ones intended. And apartments on the 2nd floor, and those are those staircases I marked in red. These spaces for rent are located in the building of Julia Felix, daughter Spurius. At the end of 5 years, the agreement is terminated. If we did not have this notice of the rental spaces, we would not identify the enterprising owner of this huge property as a woman, and we definitely would not identify her as illegitimate. Her father's name as Spurius, however, indicates that either he or she was born to an unmarried mother. This fact of birth emphatically separates her from the central elite of Pompeii, who trace their family names back over generations. Julia Felix provides us with our one absolutely clear example of female home ownership in Pompeii, although other houses hint to this possibility with different amenities. And her rental notice makes this estate the largest business in Pompeii, known to have been owned by a woman. Julia Felix's ownership of this large property and her ability to be a landlady and to rent out portions of her property is something that I think can be hard for us to grasp in the 21st century. I think this difficulty stems in part from our own history and the fact that women in the U.S. haven't been able to own property for much in our history. It wasn't until 1900 that women could own property in all U.S. states, which numbered 45 at the time. But in the ancient Roman world, women could own property, They could sign contracts. They could be taken to court. The time period I'm focusing on for this talk is of the first century BCE and CE. And during this time period, most married women married so that they remained under their father's legal power rather than being transferred to their husband's household and thus under his control or manus. This type of marriage, known as usus, meant that the husband did not gain control of his wife's property upon marriage, nor was he automatically her heir when she died, and vice versa. A wife was not automatically heir to her husband's holdings. This type of marriage also meant that a woman could control her own property after her father's death, although she required a guardian for transactions until Augustus became emperor, and Augustus ruled from 27 BCE to 14 CE. At that point, during his reign, freeborn women who had borne 3 children and freed women who had borne 4 children were no longer required to have a guardian. Julia Felix posted this notice about 60 years after Augustus died, and so we can assume she was married sine manu and probably no longer required a guardian. If we move to the tombs, we can see many more examples of female property owners, albeit at a much smaller scale. So let's move it there. I mark on the plan, or on the map, 2 of Pompeii's cemeteries. Like most cities in the western provinces of the Roman Empire, the tombs at Pompeii are located outside the city walls and face the roads leading into town. A visitor approaching Pompeii would first encounter these funerary monuments before reaching the city, and these monuments and their inscriptions would introduce the families of Pompeii and the relative social status in the community. Within these tombs, female names make up about half of the named population, which should be no surprise. But more surprisingly, women also make up half of our known tomb builders. Out of the 200 monumental tombs in the environs of Pompeii, a total of 44 of these tombs record the names of their tomb patrons. And 22 of these 44 dedicatory inscriptions list women as tomb patrons or building supervisors. Sometimes they're listed alone, and sometimes they're listed with 1 or 2 other people. This fact that women were responsible for approximately half of the tombs built between 70 BCE and 79 CE is notable for several reasons. First, it indicates that more women had control over their economic resources than is often acknowledged. Second, it suggests women bore more responsibility than is usually assumed for the needs of the family, as these tombs were built for the tomb builders, their spouses, children, and free dependents, some combination thereof. Not only that, but these tombs were built to be the locus of funerary rituals for generations to follow. And so the tomb builders had a huge impact on how subsequent generations of the family honored them. For this talk, I want to focus our attention on a group of tombs in the Nutrian Gate necropolis. Each of the entrances to Pompeian gates are named after the nearby town to which the road leads. And so the gate at the southern side of Pompeii is named the Nutrian Gate, after the city of Nutria. And I'm showing you a plan of the cemetery outside the Nutrian Gate that I had created for my book. And the tombs built by women are marked in yellow. We're going to focus on a cluster of 4 tombs, because 3 of the 4 tombs in this cluster have known female tomb builders. The dedicatory inscription is missing for that 4th tomb, so we don't know who was responsible for it. Now, let me show you what these tombs look like and the names of the female tomb builders associated with each. And so here, the photo on the left is of the 4 tombs from that cluster, and I've put the name of each known tomb builder above the tomb they built. And so we have Flavia Agathea, and then we have the tomb that lacking a dedicatory inscription. Then we have Eumachia, and then we have Bertia Philomena. In each of these tombs, we have a woman either joining forces with a man to build the tomb or building it by herself. On the right is a computer reconstruction of 3 of these tombs to show what these tombs once looked like. In Pompeii, tombs tend to stand 2 stories tall, with the lower story acting as a podium for the upper. The lower story generally displays a dedicatory inscription, while the upper story often showcases statues of the deceased. Let's take a closer look at the tomb of Bertia Philomena to see what we have. And so I've noted where the inscription once was affixed, and it reads, Marcus Octavius, son of Marcus, member of the Menenian voting tribe, Bertia Philomena, freed woman of a woman, built this shared monument in a jointly owned space for themselves and their descendants. And so this is a really exciting dedicatory inscription. It tells us so much. It tells us who the tomb is for. It's for the two people building it and their descendants. It tells us they're married. It also tells us that they jointly own the space on which the tomb was built. In addition, we have a freeborn man who is married to a freed woman, and so and this tomb dates about 50 BCE. And so it's interesting to think about the social connotations here, because it wasn't until under Augustus that it became legally fine for everyone, for most people, not senatorial elites, but for most people to marry freed or freeborn if you're in the other class. And so in this tomb, this dedicated inscription actually gives us more information than we normally get from the dedicatory inscriptions on Pompeian tombs. Usually we get the name of the patron and a declaration of who the tomb was intended for. This gives us a little bit more, which is pretty exciting. I want to look at one other tomb in this cluster, and that's the tomb next to the tomb of Bertia Philomena, and that is the tomb of Eumachia. This is the largest of all tombs in Pompeii, and it's the most ornate. And what we have, again, are two stories. The lower story is this large terrace that jets out over the sidewalk, and the secondary story has this exedra with statue niches, and above that is a frieze in the attic. The inscription, which stretches across two white marble plaques, is quite simple. It simply states, Eumachia, daughter of Lucius, built this tomb for herself and her descendants. This succinct statement names Eumachia alone, and I think it should be taken as a caution sign for the modern assumption that the actions of elite females like Eumachia were primarily intended for the political benefit of the family. In this case, the only named recipient is Eumachia herself, suggesting that her primary motivation is to provide for her funerary needs and for the needs of those under her care, and to do this with a monument that will catch the attention of passersby and prompt the community to remember her larger-than-life presence. For visitors approaching Pompeii and having to step off of the sidewalk to make room for this tomb spoke to the social importance of Eumachia, not of her son, not of her husband, not of her larger family. I want to introduce one more tomb in a different cemetery, and that is the cemetery located outside the Herculaneum Gate of Pompeii on the other side of the city. In this cemetery, there are women who pay for family tombs, but I want to focus on a tomb that speaks to a couple other aspects of women's lives in Pompeii. And these are the funerary honors some women receive from the town council, and the priesthoods the elite women were able to hold. And so here's a plan of the Herculaneum Gate Cemetery with the tombs built by women marked in yellow. This time, I want to focus on the tomb in green, which stands within 100 Roman feet of the city walls. And this is important to note because the land within 100 feet of the city walls is actually owned by the city. And people could only be buried there if they were allowed to by the town council. Here's what the tomb looks like. It's a large semicircular bench facing the road, and it provides a really wonderful place for passersby to stop and rest before entering the city. This bench tomb may look familiar to those of you familiar with the Getty Villa because it actually inspired two benches on the grounds there. The dedicatory inscription for Mamia, which is whose tomb this is written in large letters above the bench, and here's how this reads. To Mamia, daughter of Publius, public priestess, a place for burial was given by decree of the town council. And so now we know why this tomb is located where it is, within 100 Roman feet of the city walls. This is one of 19 burial plots that we have that are known to have been awarded to Pompeians by the Ordo. Of these, 5 went to women, suggesting that the former and current magistrates who comprise the town council directly recognize the contributions of contemporary women in the local community. Taken together, the funerary honors and tombs built by women provide a glimpse of how freeborn and freed women lived, died, and cared for members of their extended families, and were cared for by the larger community. Before we leave this inscription, I want to point out that Mammy is identified here as a public priestess. In Pompeii, public priestesses were voted into the position by the town council. We know the names of a total of 13 women in Pompeii who held this position, but Mammy seems to be the earliest known woman to have done so. And the time period we're talking about is the Augustan period. These women served as priestesses of one of 2 deities, Venus Pompeiana, who is a fertility goddess and the patron deity of Pompeii, or Ceres. And Ceres is the goddess of agriculture, death, and human fertility. And she actually challenged Bacchus or Dionysus for control over Campania. Beginning in the Neronian period, the public priestesses served both goddesses. So whether that's serving one or both goddesses, these priestesses would do the same things. They would officiate as sacrifices. They would host banquets. They would preside over processions for the deity, and they would lead other rites, all this in honor of the deity. In addition to serving as public priestess of Venus Pompeiana, Mamia also introduced a new cult to Pompeii, which we can see if we return to the heart and city. We return to the forum that I've marked here for you. The forum is our last stop in this tour of women in Pompeii. Here we can see women like Mamia who received public honors, held priesthoods, built civic and religious edifices, and introduced new deities into the Pompeian pantheon. Let's start with the evidence for Mamia introducing new deities into the public pantheon. And here's the inscription that gives us that information. It reads, Mamia, daughter of Publius, public priestess, built this sanctuary for the genius or guardian spirit of one of 2 deities, either of Augustus or of the colony. And she built this on her own land and with her own money. And so here we have a property owner who is choosing to donate her land for this new cult. And so she's emphasizing not only that she paid for the building, but also that she owned the land upon which it was built. In 1817, excavators found the described blocks with the inscription that I just read to you. They found these blocks missing an important word, and that is the name of the deity. And so we have the genius, but then there's a lacuna in the inscription. And so we don't know the name of whose guardian spirit Madamia was worshiping. And for a long time, scholars assumed that this is a cult to the genius of Augustus. But more recent scholarship has challenged this reading. Because nearby cities like Pozzuoli and Nola had cults dedicated to the genius of their colony, the city's guardian spirit, the missing word here may more appropriately be colony than Augustus. And if the missing word is colony, then Mamia founded a new civic cult, one dedicated to the guardian spirit of Pompeii itself. That would have been an act of enormous public significance, and it almost certainly means her temple was on the Forum, which is the religious and civic heart of the city. But her temple would not be the one that I've highlighted it in yellow here, where the inscription is usually attached to, because the imagery in this particular precinct indicates that this sanctuary was dedicated to Augustus, to divine Augustus, or the genius of Augustus. And we know that the emperor had his own priests in Pompeii beginning in 2 BCE, and this is where they would have been active. So possibly, I'd mark this as a possible location of the temple of Mamia, but I'm saying it probably isn't. This is just where it normally is placed. But whatever the precise location, Mamiya gives us our early example of an elite Pompeian of either gender who is using their own resources to expand the city's religious life. She wasn't operating at the margins of public life, she was shaping it with this dedication. Let's turn to another place along the forum where we can see a woman shaping Pompeian society, and that is Eumachia's building. Often, this inscription, it is located, the one that I was showing you on the screen on the left is located over the back entrance to the building, and then the inscription is repeated over the front. And I'll show you in a moment where it's located over the front. Here's what it says. Eumachia, daughter of Lucius, public priestess, built the Chalkidicum, Porticus, and Crypta at her own expense, and in her own name, and in the name of her son, Marcus Numistrius Fronto. She dedicated them to Augustan peace and concord. And so here we have a woman dedicating a large edifice in her own name and in the name of her son. Often this inscription has been misunderstood as stating that the complex is a joint project by Eumachia and her son, but she very clearly takes sole ownership of the project, using singular verb forms to state that she built and dedicated the complex. And she also has the phrase with her own money, sua pecunia, and its inclusion in this inscription highlights Eumachia's independent bankrolling of the new complex. The language of the dedicatory inscription underscores Eumachia's emphasis on herself as a civic benefactor and pious patron who is introducing a new cult to the city, the cult of Augustan concord and piety. These two deities were deeply rooted in the political ideology of Augustan Rome, and both had direct ties to the imperial family. Concordia Augusta was a personification of Augustan harmony. The goddess Concordia was associated not only with the political harmony that followed Roman military victories, but she also embodied the marital harmony between Augustus and Livia themselves. That bond was so celebrated that Livia dedicated an entire shrine of Concordia to Augustus in 7 BCE in Rome. Piety, or pietas, meanwhile, was the personification of religious and filial devotion, a concept that sat at the very heart of Augustan ideology. By introducing a new cult to Pompeii that wove these two deities together, Eumachia did something significant. She expanded the religious life of Pompeii in ways that both reflected a new political reality and responded to what her community actually needed. The cult she sponsored created clear community connections to the imperial family, to Augustus, who had made religious piety a cornerstone of his rule, and who held a level of religious authority that was unprecedented. Crucially, for our purposes today, I want to note that these cults would have been open to women of all social levels. That means that Eumachia's sponsorship of this imperial cult didn't just enhance her own status, it directly shaped the religious lives of other women in Pompeii, enslaved, freed women, and freeborn women alike. Now, these deities were worshipped within the enormous edifice Eumachia created at her own expense, and that was for everyone to use. And I want to just walk through the main parts of this structure so you can see how this all fits together. Here in this image, you see the portico of the forum, and I hope you can see in the architrave the dedicatory inscription. That's the one of Eumachia. On the other side of that portico is the Chalkidicum. And what this is a deep porch that appropriates the space of the forum colonnade in front of the building's entrance. Access to the space was controlled by a locking gate to the south, and the space featured 2 elevated platforms for auctioning goods or for addressing a crowd. The facade wall on either side of the doorway leading into Eumachia's building beyond featured niches for statues. And we know of some of the statues that were in here. These included one of Romulus holding the armor of the opposing king he defeated, and another of Aeneas fleeing Troy with his father and son. Both of these statues echoed statues that were in the Forum of Augustus in Rome. No other statue inscriptions are known from the Chalkidicum, but we have extant 15 bases for standing or seated honorific statues, and these are the bases that are on the back sides of the columns. These statues would have faced the building's facade. The forest of statues clustered in the Chalkidicum presumably included imperial family members and Pompeian elites, including members of Eumachia's family. And her edifice, her built structure, served as a visual and social frame for this honorific display. If we go inside the building, we move into the porticus, which is a central courtyard surrounded by a colonnaded walkway. And this space may have provided the first public green space in Pompeii. At the very far end of the porticus and along the primary axis is a large niche. And within that niche, I hope you can see that there are huge statue bases. Presumably, the cult statues of Augustine, Concord, and Piety occupied the central statue base. And people have suggested that they're flanked by honorific statues of imperial family members like Livia and her son Tiberius. The third part of this complex, the crypta, was a more secure area. This is basically a passageway that goes around three sides of the porticus. Part of the crypta could be locked, and so it's thought that this is a place where more expensive goods were sold or stored. And often it's guessed that expensive textiles were stored here or were sold here. And the reason why people suggested that textiles were sold here is because Eumachia had a close connection to the fullers. How do we know that? Well, the statue of Eumachia that I showed you at the beginning of the talk actually comes from this complex. It comes from the crypta. This marble portrait of Eumachia was found in 1820, and I'm showing you a modern replica of it. But what this replica is standing on is an inscribed marble-clad base. The tall base was attached to the back wall of a broad niche located on the central axis of the large multi-purpose building that Eumachia had built and paid for. And the honorific inscription on the base reads, "For Eumachia, daughter of Lucius and public priestess, the fullers set this up." This dedicatory inscription succinctly names Eumachia and the Queenie group honoring her. And this group is the Association of Cloth Workers who felted wool and laundered clothing. This statue provides evidence of Eumachia's importance to the fullers. This would go without saying if we were talking about an honorific statue set up by a collegium for a man, but I want to say out loud that Eumachia's honoring by the fullers is something that is for her. There's an often repeated scholarly assumption that she is being singled out for this honor because of the industry's reliance on a male family member, either her father or more typically her husband, Marcus Numistrius Fronto, who shares the name of her son. In the past, people have worked backwards from the statue's dedicatory inscription to suggest that the Numistri were long associated with sheep farming. They immigrated from Numistria in southern Italy, it's been suggested, and that, this is all scholarly suggestions, that after Eumachia and Numistrius Fronto married, then the Eumachi inherited the lands adapted for sheep farming and became patrons of the woolen industry in Pompeii. But this whole sequence is based solely on this inscription that we have on this honorific statue of Eumachia. There's no material evidence of the involvement of the Numistri with the wool trade, and the only evidence of the involvement of the Eumachi is this inscription that links Eumachia to the industry. Material evidence instead ties Eumachia's birth family to the tile and brick-making industry, and we have stamps on wine amphora that are found as far away as southern France that indicate that this family owned the clay fields and workshops that made wine amphorae. The fuller's gift of an honorific statue makes a public declaration of the collegium's close ties to Eumachia as a wealthy Pompeian individual with a strong network of social connections upon which the collegium could draw. This network definitely included her family members, but there's no evidence that the Numistri or Eumachia familial ties to the industry or another individual that either family was connected to the fullers beyond Eumachia. To conclude, I want to say that the material evidence at Pompeii provides an extraordinary opportunity to see how individual women lived, worked, and shaped their community, And these remains give us a much fuller picture of female social agency than we would get from ancient texts. From the tombs where 50% of the tomb builders were women, to the city center, where 50% of the cult temples added in the Augustan period were built by women, we can see their impact. We can also see the receptiveness of the town council and other community groups to these efforts, as 1 in 4 honorific tomb plots and 1 in 4 extant honorific statues were given to women. The material record of Pompeii provides us with the names of almost 800 individual women beyond the ones I've talked about today, and provides traces of the activities of countless more unnamed women. It is up to us to look for them and recognize them in the material record. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda, for a really fascinating talk. So much information there, and also for staying well within the time so we have time for discussion and to address some of the many questions people have asked. I've been looking at the Q&A as well as the chat, and the chat's been very lively, but I asked folks who have put their questions in the chat, please put them in the Q&A, because that's where I have better access to them. So I'm going to be going through some of the questions in the Q&A, which vary from the very focused on elements of architecture and inscriptions that you've addressed directly to the more general, Brenda. And I'm going to start with the focused ones and then move out to the more general ones. And Gripton asks, it's interesting to note that Eumakia was not granted a public burial by the town council, but she has the largest tomb. And she says, and is that almost an insult to the men of the council? She wonders why Eumakia, as a priestess and patron, didn't get a public burial. And I know you don't have the answer, but maybe you have some ideas on that, Brenda.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something I've thought about a lot. First, one thing, Eumakia having the largest tomb, what this tells us is that she owned that land. What our tombs are going to be that are not gifted your burial plots. They're going to be owned. The land is going to be owned by the person building the tomb, and so if this may be, just this statement of ownership. With that said, though, the tomb does extend out over the sidewalk, which other tombs do not do. Nowhere else in Pompeii do they do that. So she had some sort of special dispensation to interrupt the flow of traffic there. I want to answer this question by going to another woman in town. Her name is Nevolia Tike. And she actually has 2 tombs. One that she built, one that her husband built. The tomb that her husband built is actually a tomb for her and her husband, and it's a funerary honor. It's another of those burial plots given as an honor. And so in that instance, usually when people talk about this tomb, it gets a little nutty. Nevolia Tike's tomb is well decorated. Municius Faustus' tomb, which is her husband's, the one he built, is much lesser made. And so people assume that her tomb was built after his tomb and she did it because she wasn't happy with it. And once he died, she could do better. We have to be really careful there because the tomb he built was built on civic land. It's an honor. And so what we might have here, we can't date that the tomb is better than 50 to 60 CE for the 2 tombs. What we might have here actually is someone who built a tomb and then they were given the civic honor. And so what we might see here with Eumakia's tomb is that she went ahead and built a tomb while she was alive, not knowing if she would be given an honor or not. And I think she wouldn't have been alone in that. So we see that example with Nevolia Tike.
Great. Complicated, and especially the 2 tombs, and there are questions about that. But another question, particularly about Eumakia's tomb, which we see in the middle of the screen now, but you showed earlier a reconstruction drawing with the upper stories, and Lynn Robb asks, how do we know or surmise the appearance of those uppermost elements of Eumachia's tomb?
Yeah, this tomb was actually excavated in the 1950s, so there's more of it extant than might have happened if it was excavated earlier. And what we have from here, actually, we have bits of an Amazonomachy, the battle between the Greeks and Amazons, that would have. So we have just basically two pieces of it that would have decorated the attic, is where it's been reconstructed because of the size of it. It makes sense. And then we also have pieces of two oversized statues, one man and one woman. And so in that reconstruction, you saw that the the statues, and one of those statues in those three niches at the back. That's how the decorative program is put back into it. It's the what was found at the tomb. Um, Other than that, uh, oh, and then also, the back of this tomb retains on that second story, basically a blind facade, architectural facade, and so we can assume that that continued around the front. So there's hints in the archaeological record that we just don't see as we're walking past it today.
Right. The other thing, of course, we don't see are the bodies of the deceased, and there are several questions about where in this large tomb the bodies were, and a question about that vexed uh, challenge for us about cremation versus inhumation, and do we know what became of Eumachia herself?
I have some exciting news here. We probably have Eumakia here in this tomb. So that first level, that terrace, on that terrace in the 1990s, they re-excavated it. And when they re-excavated it, they found three cremations. And there's one cremation at the very center of that terrace. And next to that cremation and associated with it is a funerary pyre, the remains of which include pieces of a gold necklace, excuse me, gold hairnet, sorry, and a necklace that probably had pearls. And so what we think is that Yumbakia was, her body was burned, on that terrace, and then buried in the center of that terrace. And so we don't have any inscriptions that say that she's there. We don't usually in Pompeii. We have these small little markers where people left libations, liquid offerings for the dead. And we don't have some of those chances are inscribed. We don't have any inscribed with her name. But the placement of this cremation at the very center of the terrace suggests that, and the fact that it's a wealthy woman's remains suggests that we probably had her burial. The tomb itself, the back the semicircular cathedra, the back of it has a door, and, in there, it's basically a hollow space, and there's room in there for burials. These would be cremations. I say burials, but I should say cremations. It's cremation at this time in Pompeii. And, there's room for cremations in there, but none were found, which is interesting.
Great. Uh, Hannah Woodall, who is uh, a great fan of yours and has read your books and your research, is particularly interested in the comparison you made uh, sort of between Eumachia's um forum and Livia's, and wondered if you might speak more about the relationship between Livia and Augustus and Eumachia, even if they didn't actually know each other. Now, my editorializing, but how Eumachia was sort of setting herself up, you know, as a, emulating the imperial couple.
Yeah, and this is such an interesting connection, and many scholars over the last 20 years have really dug into it and thought about it. And so I'm going to kind of synthesize where we are, right? So this isn't me, this is the field. And so um, the cults that Eumachia chose of Augusta Concord and Piety seem to be tying Eumachia to Livia and Livia's son Tiberius. And Remember, Eumakia dedicated this in the name of herself and her son. And so we seem to be having this deliberate paralleling of the imperial mother and the son with the Pompeian mother and son in this complex. And the way we see this, the porticus that I described for you, this actually seems to be mimicking the appearance, or at least the size and of a macellum that Livia built in it's called the Porticus of Livia in Rome. And in this porticus, there's that was where the temple to Concordia was placed that Livia built for her husband Augustus in 70 BCE. So there's a lot of parallels between them. Everywhere you go in this complex, you see references to Rome. I mean, you have it in the deities, of course, but you have it in the display of statues. We have to think back statues of the imperial family here, uh, as well as statues of Pompeians. It's very clearly looking to Rome and taking inspiration in a way that presumably Eumachi was hoping would be noticed by those in Rome.
Well, this feeds into a couple of similar questions we have from different listeners, which are about based on the archaeological evidence as well as the literary evidence. Um, about the status or roles of women outside of Rome in rural areas in the provinces versus in Rome. Do we think they had greater liberties, lesser liberties, about the same? Is there something different going on in Pompeii and elsewhere than there was in the capital, or is one really a mirror of the other?
That's a great question, and I think, where we can say things are different is the senatorial and imperial women. They would be much more tightly reined in, I think, and then, in terms of what they can do, and it's going back to I described how, usus marriage works, and this is a type of marriage that was used by almost everyone at the time period I'm talking about, but, it may have not been as popular among the senatorial and imperial families, uh, in part, um what that means is that the property would then move to the husband's family, right? And Livia, if you think about it, Livia was adopted, um, with in Augustus's will, into his family, right? She was adopted by Augustus briefly when he died. She became Julia Augusta. Um, and so I think that if we are talking about senatorial and imperial women, we're talking about a different group of women. But if we were talking about women in Rome who are not of those classes, I think it's probably safe to say that we have similarities with what we've seen in Pompeii, with the caveat that the women who are doing these large projects in Rome are going to be the imperial women, not the wealthy women who have the means to do so, but not the status.
Thank you. Kathy Ferris asks, what was the difference in life expectancy for men and women? And could that have affected the number of female tomb builders? Do we know?
Well, good question. This is a little outside my range of knowledge. Basically, most childhood is dangerous for both genders. Childbirth is dangerous for women. If you even get to there, you're okay, right? Usually, the oldest woman we know of from the um, uh, tombs in Pompeii, she was 80. So we do have some women living quite well, right? Um, yeah, I'm sorry. I just don't know the average life expectancies of men and women. That's a great question. I'm gonna look it up after this talk.
Fair enough. I mean, knowing averages is very difficult. Um, more notional. One of our attendees says it's interesting to hear more about the roles of women than we usually do. Could you talk a bit about this idea of public modesty that a woman needed to model, as in the image of Eumakia, even if she was relatively wealthy or powerful? How she has to act modestly and that virtue in antiquity.
Yeah. So all of our honorific statues of women are going to have them with their heads covered. They're veiled, and that's an, that's emphasizing their modesty. Like the idea that when you went outside the house, you'd be covered. You'd wear several layers. All of our honorific statues also have them wearing 2, even 3 layers of clothes, really covering up and being this nice, respectable uh, matron, right? Yeah, modesty is huge. In our historical sources, our Roman sources, this is hammered over and over and over again. And I think we're seeing the importance of it also in how these statues, conform to a type. What gets interesting is if we started to look at, we didn't today, but if we looked at the statues of women that are in houses, we have some busts of women in houses. They don't have their heads covered, and so it's definitely a signal of a woman being out in public. I think is how we might start reading those. You just need to emphasize visually, that you are this, honorable woman. The way you do that is by covering your head.
Right. Well, we've gone past the hour. There are a few other questions left. One is, thank you. Are there even more women like Eumakia from Pompeii? And I think you gave us the answer to that in your opener. Over 800 mentioned inscriptions, and I think your book is the place to go to learn more about them. I want to thank Brenda Longfellow for this wonderful talk. I want to thank everybody who tuned in today for watching, and especially those who submitted questions. And I very much encourage those of you in Los Angeles or visiting Los Angeles to visit the Getty Villa. We don't have Eumakia here, but we do have portraits of imperial women and non-imperial women in our galleries. So please visit us, and you can learn how to visit the villa at getty.edu. Thank you all once again, and bye-bye.